Good afternoon. Welcome to the Improving Undergraduate STEM Education, Education and Human Resources Program webinar. The focus of today's webinar will be on the institutional and community transformation track of the IUSE program. I'd like to introduce the folks that you're hearing online. My name is Ellen Carpenter, and I'm a program director at the National Science Foundation in the Division of Undergraduate Education, and I'm joined by my colleague.
My name is Andrea Nixon. I'm also program director in the Division of Undergraduate Education.
For your information, this session is being recorded, so we're actually taking a record of the chat questions that get asked, and by participating in the session, you're giving us permission to make this recording of both your questions and your comments about the session.
And as we get started, I want to make sure that you all know that there are a series of resources that are available to you. You'll have a link to the IUSE EHR webpage. There will be a link to a search interface where you can look for IUSE awards, prior awards. There's a link to the solicitation, a survey for you to complete after we've gone through the webinar, and then there will be a series of slide decks. One, we had a webinar on the 5th that was designed to help people think through the program, the IUSE program overall, and to think about preparing proposals. There was also a slide deck there that's focused, that's from a webinar that was held on October 30th that was specific to teacher preparation proposals. The slides from today will be made available as well.
And during today's slide deck, you'll have the opportunity to post some questions to us, some of which we will try to answer live. There is an attendee question box that you'll be able to type those questions into, and we'll prompt you at several points through this webinar with a slide that says questions, and that's your cue that we're willing to take questions at that point in the presentation. The question for you is, what would you like to do? Things like improving students' performance and retention in STEM courses and STEM majors, increasing the participation of women and students from underrepresented groups in STEM courses, preparing students to enter the STEM workforce, increase faculty engagement with their STEM teaching, or make your institution a better place for STEM teaching and learning. If any of those things apply to you, then the IUSE program may be a possible place for you to submit your ideas and to perhaps get some funding from the National Science Foundation to support your efforts. We're going to do a couple of things today. We're going to do an introduction to the IUSE program, including an overview of the new solicitation that was released in September. We'll talk a little bit about the organization of the program, what the components are, and then we'll spend some time focusing on the institutional and community transformation track of the program. This track actually features two unique things that aren't available in the other track of IUSE, which is the Engaged Student Learning track. Those things are a theory of change and the idea of setting up a capacity building proposal. So we'll focus on those fairly in depth as we go through this webinar. We'll also provide you with a slide linking you to some resources that might be helpful as you think about a project that you're putting together. And if we have time at the end, we actually have a set of slides that is specifically for those folks who are new to NSF. And so we can go through some of the mechanics of proposal preparation, what the components of a proposal are, and some helpful hints for proposal writing that you might find useful as you go about putting together your projects. So for our introduction to this program, we have a couple of things that we would like to do and we would like to achieve in the IUSE program. In this program, we hope to improve the quality and effectiveness of education of undergraduates in all STEM fields. Notice this does not say STEM majors. We refer to students in STEM classes. It can be majors, it can be non-majors, it can be any student, any undergraduate student that is engaging with STEM classes and coursework. We also hope to improve teaching in STEM teaching and learning for all students in undergraduate institutions and or the institutional environment where these teaching activities are occurring. Proposals can be accepted from any type of institution of higher education, as well as a bunch of organizations that are affiliated with the higher education endeavor. And this might include things like professional societies and organizations that work with or represent institutions of higher education. Higher education can be a 2-year college, it can be a 4-year college, it can be any permutation of education that is provided to undergraduate students. Within the program, we've actually funded institutions of many different types, and so this chart just illustrates the type of institutions that have received funding from the program and the types of degrees that are offered by these institutions. So we fund both public and private institutions. We fund nonprofits, and we also fund some business or industry type proposals that are associated with undergraduate education endeavors. Many of the institutions that we fund award doctoral degrees, but significant fractions award simply master's degrees, bachelor's, or associate's degrees. And some of them, such as the professional societies, for example, do not provide degrees at all. So the question is, what do you want to do? And so we're going to give you a little bit of an opportunity to think about the types of things that you might think about as a project that you would propose to the IUSE program. So this is an opportunity for you to just take a couple of minutes and sit down and maybe brainstorm a few ideas. For those of you who already have a proposal or an idea in the works, this is the time to pull up that proposal, take a quick look, refresh your memory about the objectives of the proposal, and maybe try to keep those in mind as we go through the rest of this webinar. So what we would like for you to do is to write down 3 things you have been wanting to do to improve STEM teaching or learning, to take a look at those ideas and figure out which one might be the most compelling to you, and then to reflect on that idea and how it might be implemented. What would it take to get your idea rolling? Would it take money? Would it take links to collaborators? Would it take an organization or people that you would like to work with? And then maybe to develop a very simple plan to keep in mind as a target for an IUSE proposal. So we're going to time you for about 2 minutes and give you an opportunity to think these things through. Got about another 30 seconds to keep your ideas going here. Okay, you should be winding down, got your plan of action in hand, got your ideas all set, ready to go, and so we'll continue. So the IUSE program is divided into 2 major tracks. These are the Engaged Student Learning track and the Institutional and Community Transformation track. And so this section of the webinar will talk a little bit about those 2 tracks, again with a very specific focus on the Institutional and Community Transformation track, as well as provide you with some information about the levels that you can apply to, the funding limits for each of those levels, and the program deadlines. So the 2 tracks in a nutshell are Engaged Student Learning and Institutional and Community Transformation. So the Engaged Student Learning track is really a student-centered track, and so it can focus on things like the development, testing, and use of teaching practices and curricular innovations to engage your students and to improve their learning, their persistence, and their retention in STEM. Whereas the Institutional and Community Transformation track focuses more broadly on the transformation of colleges and universities to implement the highly effective STEM teaching and learning practices that have been garnered from, among other studies, things like Engaged Student Learning projects. So the Engaged Student Learning really focuses on student learning. And this can either be a direct or an indirect focus. And by direct, I mean these would be projects that look specifically at the students and things that the students are interacting with. You know, maybe things that they're doing in the classroom, research experiences, things like that, that are focused on their learning. Whereas an indirect focus might be focused more on the faculty level and might provide things like professional development for faculty to help them learn how to use active learning techniques or other engaged student learning types of strategies, bringing those practices into their classroom, or helping redesign curricula for these students to help improve their learning. This track supports the development of improved instructional materials and or methods of providing this instruction and helps to engage students to improve their learning and to increase their retention in STEM. There are a number of different things that one might envision as possible engaged student learning projects. And so I've got a list here of a range of approaches that might be considered. Now, this is certainly not a limiting list, but it might be a place to develop some ideas for engaged student learning types of projects. Things like developing and implementing novel instructional methods, things you could do differently in your classroom, virtual reality, sort of things like that. Designing and assessing metrics to figure out what's actually occurring in the STEM teaching and learning, or to actually look at the student outcomes more directly within the classroom. As we mentioned, faculty learning through professional development is certainly an appropriate topic for engaged student learning. These projects can be either discipline-based or they can focus on interdisciplinary initiatives. We might look at re-envisioning or adaptation of learning environments, incorporating more research-based things, incorporating other techniques and methods and technologies that have not been used prior in the classrooms that you are working with. These projects might include co-curricular activities that would help increase student motivation and persistence in STEM, ways to keep your students engaged in the classroom and keep them actually focused on their studies long enough to complete a STEM degree. These projects can also be sort of a bird's eye view, doing a synthesis or meta-analysis of prior work to uncover trends and to provide evidence of best practices that can be applied more broadly or in different areas and different disciplines from where they originated. And we've strongly encouraged collaborations between 2-year and 4-year institutions to develop innovative pathways for transfer and for student success. There are a number of target populations. First of all, students at 2-year and 4-year institutions are certainly the prime focus for engaged student learning projects. Students who are in STEM majors are an additional focus, and these can either be students who are declared, and that would be probably an upper division type of student, or students who are just at the beginning of their academic careers and may not yet have declared a major, but might be encouraged to take STEM classes and to consider this as a possible option. We're also interested in targeting students whose courses of study require solid skills and knowledge of STEM principles. An example of this might be things like quantitative data skills, learning how to use large data sets, analyze that type of data, and incorporate it into STEM instruction, or even in some cases into classes that are not STEM-based, but are developing and using these skills as well. Another population might be non-STEM majors that are in general education classes, and so this could be improving the experiences of those types of students, perhaps building in more inquiry-based learning activities that would fulfill them or provide them with a better experience or a different experience, one that actually envisions a little bit more with how science is practiced and not how science is generally taught. An additional focus, as I've mentioned, is STEM faculty members and providing professional development for these folks to improve and hone their teaching skills to more effectively work with their student populations. And an additional area is the training of pre-service STEM teachers. So these would be undergraduate students that are ultimately interested in serving as science teachers in K through 12 or STEM teachers in the K through 12 classrooms. So preparing these students for that type of career.
I'm going to talk a little bit at a high level about the institutional and community transformation track. Then we'll have an opportunity for you to ask some questions, and then we'll take a deep dive into the institutional and community transformation track. And that's where we'll spend the bulk of our time. The ICT track, or Institutional and Community Transformation track, focuses on improving evidence-based instruction at the level of academic departments, institutions, and other organizations or communities. By communities, we're referring to academic communities, so they maybe have disciplinary affinities, and organizations may be organizations of which colleges and universities are members. It also focuses on supporting efforts to build and understand systemic change in undergraduate STEM education. and it aims to use appropriate theories of change, and again, we'll go into that in a minute, to transform institutions. There are a range of approaches, including, but again, not limited to, these are just illustrative examples. The transformation of high enrollment classes to include evidence-based teaching practices, developing teaching evaluation rubrics rooted in research-based frameworks, the development of faculty communities to improve accessibility or sustainability of evidence-based practices, identifying best practices or research-based practices to guide institutional transformation, the inclusion of non-tenure track faculty or instructors through policy or professional development opportunities, and the identification of common elements across disciplines, programs, institutions, or systems that support students from underrepresented groups so that they may be successful in STEM coursework or majors. This is our first opportunity to pause for questions. Please use the question interface if you'd like to submit questions for us to answer. We'll pause here for a minute to let you populate the questions.
Well, we've got one immediate question,
okay.
Which is about whether a college that's possibly interested in applying for both the Engaged Student Learning and Institutional and Community Transformation tracks for different grants for each of those tracks, and wondering whether it's possible to apply for both at the same time. The answer is yes, but there are some limits. Each individual principal or co-principal investigator is limited to no more than 3 proposals per fiscal year, which for us is running October 1st through September 30th, although the number of proposals that can come from a single institution is unlimited. So that would certainly allow you to apply for both of those tracks within the same competition.
I'd also like to kind of build off of that question by saying that we realize that the Engaged Student Learning and Institutional and Community Transformation tracks are kind of the flip side of the coin, of the same coin. And so it may be the case that you would find it helpful to talk to a program officer to think about which track is the best fit for a particular project. When those questions come up, I typically will ask about where's the preponderance of work that's proposed in a particular project. And that's one way of weighing which track that might be the best fit for your particular project and proposal.
And one question is whether the target population for the pre-service STEM teachers in undergraduate teacher preparation programs, is it okay for these types of programs to reside in colleges of education, and whether that denies eligibility? The answer is these programs can actually reside anywhere within the institution as long as they are focused on training STEM teachers specifically. So that training can happen within a school of education. It can also happen within the various disciplines, biology, chemistry, whatever is available at the institution. So as long as the program is focused on teacher training, it would be appropriate.
That's a really good question. It may be coming from someone who's familiar with the NOYS program, the Robert Noyes Teacher Scholarship Program. In that case, there are very specific constraints that came out of the legislation for the NOYS program that makes the location of a particular major important, if it's a school of education or not. The IUSE program is extremely flexible in terms of the kind of work that we're able to support. And so that's a point of differentiation between the NOYS program and the Improving Undergraduate STEM Education program.
Move on?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, so fields of study as diverse as ecology, sociology, and education use these categories of micro, meso, and macro to describe scales or units of analysis. IUSE's, in the Improving Undergraduate STEM Education program, IUSE's overarching program goals are to improve the quality and effectiveness of education in all STEM fields and to enable the NSF to lead national progress towards a diverse and innovative workforce and a STEM literate public. For the purposes of our discussion today in this webinar, we'll consider the IUSE program goals at the macro or at the national level. Institutional and community transformation projects tend to focus on the meso level, insofar as they may focus on academic departments, institutions, or other organizations or communities. To round out the description, work at the micro level might focus on outcomes at the level of individual students, faculty members, or courses. Particularly if you are new to the work at the meso level, theories of change may help you situate your project and identify elements that would be useful to you. Today, we're going to focus in on the meso level again for ICT. So the ICT proposal should describe a theory of change. That's called out specifically in the solicitation. It's critical if you're putting together a proposal that you identify what you mean by that for the purposes of your particular project. And we'll dive into all of these in greater depth. That you include research literature and a theoretical perspective concerning change. That you're recognizing STEM higher education as a complex system. The ways we make decisions about the curriculum and curricular development and courses of study can be very nuanced in colleges and universities. And this institutional community transformation track is designed to support that kind of work. So for example, in order to promote institutional change, you may want to think about how to include teams of faculty members, support from academic chairs, departmental chairs, college deans, or others within the institution's academic leadership, or support from provosts or presidents. What do we mean by a theory of change? A theory of change functions to identify and organize the dimensions of the proposed work. This is coming directly from the IUSE EHR solicitation. While proposed projects will vary in the approach and the underlying theory or theories of change identified, promising proposals will recognize that STEM higher education is a complex system and that achieving goals involves analyzing and addressing organizational factors, such as institutional policies and practices or opportunities for professional growth. There is a paper that's cited in this solicitation by Connolly and Seymour, and there it's interesting for a number of reasons. It may be helpful for you because it unpacks theories of change from 9 NSF-funded projects relating to prior NSF programs, the Math Science Partnerships, the Course Curriculum and Laboratory Improvement CCLI program, and the Systemic Changes in Undergraduate Chemistry Curriculum Initiative. So theories of change can drive programs as well as people. A program seeking to effect change or reform often tacitly reflects on theories of change of the program's designers. Because reformers tend to jump from identifying a problem to choosing ways of ameliorating it, they often do not articulate the reasons why those strategies will achieve the desired changes. That is the program's theory of change. Theories of change matter because they are usually implicit, and what remains unseen cannot be questioned. For our purposes today, theories of change can be incredibly helpful because they prompt you to unpack the assumptions in your own proposal, and that can be incredibly helpful in enabling you to make clear the goals and the expectations and the steps in your particular project that you're proposing. People who are new to the roles of departmental chairs, to being institutional planners, to being provosts or presidents, often go to institutes that are based on this particular work. Bowman and Deal's Reframing Organizations, and the current edition is the 6th edition, where Connolly and Seymour challenge us to look at structural and cultural factors that can enhance or limit chances of success. The Bowman and Deal reframing approach prompts people to think in terms of 4 frames. The structural frame relates to the organizational structure or hierarchy, or how work is organized at a particular institution. The human resource frame can focus on, for example, development, professional development in our case. Might be one example. The political frame has to do with the politics of organizations, which is not specific to higher education, or the symbolic or cultural frame that can be incredibly powerful. So there's a body of literature that's focused on organizational change, broadly writ, and this is one of the classic works. Again, I don't say this to be prescriptive. Any of the works that we're going to be pointing to are just exemplars. It'll be important for you to identify theories of change that are well suited to the project that you have in mind. So theories of change require that your project articulates assumptions underlying the project plan. Making assumptions explicit will enable you to more clearly articulate elements of your project to reviewers. It should prompt you to think about project elements that are required for success, and consider the kinds of data that you'll need to analyze to determine whether your project is proceeding as expected. We are going to be looking at ways that you can identify prior IUSE EHR awards in the institutional and community transformation track that include projects that employ theories of change. And in some cases, they've also contributed to the theories of change that are specific to STEM learning environments. So let's take a moment and walk through the process of searching for funded ICT projects from the last year. If you go to nsf.gov, you'll see the following interface. And you'll see if you hover your cursor over or your mouse over the awards tab, you'll be able to select search awards. I'm just going to pause in case you're playing along at home. When you click on the search award tab, in the last year, we've made it so that the phrase institutional and community transformation, in quotation marks here, you can use that as a search strategy, that shows up in all of the ICT awards in the previous year. When you enter that and click on search, it's possible to refine the output that you get. And here, I'm suggesting that you select a filter for the Directorate for Education and Human Resources. That's the directorate in which the Division of Undergraduate Education and this particular program takes place. So this is one way to identify prior ICT awards, Institutional and Community Transformation Awards. Again, you'll be able to get these slides from this webinar in the future, and then you can have these screen snapshots as well. I have included at the end of this slide deck, and we won't go through it in the webinar, but there's also an advanced search option, and so I've given you some suggestions there. Prior to this past year's Institutional and Community Transformation Awards, in the IUSE Awards, that phrase, institutional and community transformation, did not occur in all of the abstracts of the awards. So we're going to pause here for an activity. And I would be grateful if you could put in the question interface that you have. What other search terms might you use to identify ICT awards from prior years? So please click the red Ask a Question button and compose suggestions and hit the Submit button. We'll pause here as some suggestions come through and we'll read those out. We'll pause for a minute to let you make some suggestions. Okay, some great suggestions are coming in. They include STEM learning, institutional capacity, theory of change, transforming STEM education, and institutional change, community impacts, broader impacts, creating a culture of, and then an ellipsis of, STEM student success, educational innovation. They're just pouring in, that's fabulous. Institutional advancement, academic support staff, interesting. Okay, curricular revision and organizational change, undergraduate education. So we're getting a series of these that are very, very helpful. That's good. Well, thank you very much. So as you can see, it can be helpful to think broadly, more broadly, about the kind of search terms, since in prior awards we don't have that boilerplate in the abstracts. It can be helpful to, if you have a project idea, we'll talk about this in a little bit, to approach program officers, and they will be able to point you, in many cases, to prior awards. What we're able to talk about, and I have a few examples here, are the elements of awards that are public, and that is to say the titles and the abstracts that are available. And we have three examples that I want to share with you today. The first one is from DePauw University. This is a small liberal arts college testing a model for transforming STEM general education at liberal arts schools, led by Jacqueline Roberts and her colleagues, Pamela Prompsom and Michael Roberts. This is an interesting example for a number of reasons. So the project's goal is to test an integrated bottom-up and top-down model of institutional reform within a College of Liberal Arts STEM division. So at some levels, this is very interesting because it's recognizing the nuanced ways in which curricular decision-making and development are undertaken, both from a bottom-up and a top-down approach. The broad strategy is to provide a momentum to fuel transition from an active mobilization stage of this faculty-driven initiative to subsequent stages, implementation, and then institutionalization. As you'll see in a subsequent slide, those are stages that are identified in a theory of change that this group has used to develop their project ideas as their theory of change. Initial grassroots efforts have led to base-level support for division-wide engagement of this goal. This model of change is focused on moving the STEM faculty towards significant course transformation, reflective of the growing evidence base indicated in what works, while simultaneously developing a productive STEM learning community. This will be accomplished partly through the Curriculum Reforms Award. So they had an award program that was funded by this IUSE award that would be made to individuals or faculty teams to design their courses or to develop new team-taught interdisciplinary courses. Linked to the awards are best practices, pedagogical workshops that also engage disciplinary faculty teams from other institutions. So this is an example in which faculty development and workshops are incorporated into an ICT project. And finally, the project is building on the work of Ann Austin, her work promoting evidence-based change in undergraduate science education, and the work of Susan Elrod and Adriana Kazar, facilitating interdisciplinary learning. The institution itself will add additional diversity to the group of institutions supported by EHR grants working to achieve institutional transformation. One of the reasons why this project is an interesting exemplar is that it's taking a theory of change and it's applying it in a different institutional context. Within the IUSE program, it's really powerful to be posing questions about what works, for whom, and in what context. And this is an example of a project in which they're incorporating theories of change in a very specific context, in this case, a liberal arts institution. The next project I want to highlight for you was titled Integrating and Scaffolding Research into Undergraduate STEM Curricula, Probing Faculty, Student, Disciplinary, and Institutional Pathways to Transformational Change. This award was given to the Council on Undergraduate Research, and Beth Ambos was the head of that organization. You can see the institutional team listed here, or not, excuse me, the project team listed here. This was a project that was designed to achieve a cohesive curriculum that initiates students into a culture of inquiry and research. In the discipline, departments will use a backward design approach to develop scaffolded research-rich courses and assignments that build on deliberate ways to guide students to greater independence and ownership of their learning. To just pause for a moment, this was a project in which multiple institutions who were committed to giving their students undergraduate research experiences think through entire majors and use a process called backward design to scaffold or give multiple exposures to the kinds of experiences that the departments wanted their students to have that relate to undergraduate research opportunities. Two overarching research questions that were examined as a part of this project are, what effect do student characteristics have on student learning experiences and outcomes in a scaffolded, inquiry-driven curriculum? And two, how do different departmental approaches and distinct disciplinary cultures impact the integration of components and outcomes of the undergraduate research curriculum? The methods that were employed were mixed methods approach that would be used to address those two research questions, and they involved a number of data gathering efforts, as you can see here. They were also developing standardized and experimental questions for the National Survey of Student Engagement, or NSE, that some of you may have heard of, and the Faculty Survey of Student Engagement. The theory of change model that develops from this project will allow, or that they're working on now as the project unfolds, a broad and diverse range of institutional types and departments or disciplines to assess their readiness for research scaffolded curricula and provide key insights into the effects of curricular transformation on student achievement and organizational and cultural change. So this is a project, just stepping back for a moment, in which there was a competitive process and 12 institutions joined up to have two departments at each of the institutions commit to this backwards design process. And so this is an example of which the project was focused on affecting change, but they were also simultaneously studying the process of change as it unfolded at multiple institutions. Finally, the third example is coming from a research center. When Ellen earlier was talking about the institutional types that receive IUSE funding, this is an example of a project coming out of a research center. So the title of it is Evaluating the Potential of Community College Guided Pathways Reforms to Increase Undergraduate STEM Success. And Davis, or Paul Jenkins, was the leader of this out of Teachers College at Columbia University. This is a project in which the project team partnered with individuals with 3 states, Ohio, Tennessee, and Washington, looking at statewide community college guided pathways reforms. The goals of the project were to evaluate how those guided pathways reforms are changing practices in STEM education, advising, and other supports. What barriers and facilitators college and STEM program leaders face in implementing these reforms, what metrics colleges could use to formatively evaluate the effects of these reforms on STEM education or STEM program effectiveness, and what relationships exist between guided pathways reforms and enrollment, early progress, and persistence in undergraduate STEM programs by community college students generally, and underrepresented students in particular. To round this out, the research design was based, again, on a mixed methods approach that will include analysis of quantitative data and then subsequent interviews and qualitative analysis of the interview and focus group data. And they were focusing, it was an interesting dissemination plan insofar as they're not only thinking about peer-reviewed journal articles, but also practitioner-focused reports. The study is designed to inform practices and public policy through the identification and validation of metrics. The project team will produce a practitioner's guide, as we mentioned earlier, that includes metrics for formative use to evaluate the effects of guided pathways in STEM education. So those are just a few examples of the kind of ICT awards. One at a small college, a liberal arts college, one that was a coordinated effort amongst 12 institutions led by the Council on Undergraduate Research, and the third through a research center. So they are all examples in which they have been grounded in the research literature and theoretical perspectives concerning change. And they also seek to contribute to our understanding of what works for whom and in what context. And again, at this meso level, as I noted in that prior slide, sorry, the slides got out of order somehow. This focus on teams of faculty members, support from departments, chairs, colleges, deans, or others within the institution's academic leadership, and support from potentially provost or presidents are all suited to this work at a meso level that takes us up the level of abstraction from individual courses or faculty or courses of study. So with that, we're going to pause for a series of questions, and some have already come in. Here, another user. Okay. Well, ICT ones I just brought. Okay. How is ICT different from RED other than the department chair having to be a PI for RED? RED is focused on its revolutions in engineering.
Revolutionizing engineering departments. So it's actually focused specifically on engineering students. And it does have some very specific requirements. It's actually a program that's operated out of the engineering directorate at NSF rather than out of the Education and Human Resources Directorate.
There was an earlier question about whether or not someone could develop their own theory of change. And
so how receptive are you to homegrown theories of change?
We are receptive as long as they're well developed. So that is to say, if you feel like in the literature the extant theories of change do not apply appropriately for the project that you have in mind, I would encourage you to develop and test your own theory of change, but it will be important to situate that in the larger literature so that it's clear that you are informed about prior work and that you're in a position to generate new knowledge and to help us understand theories of change to support undergraduate STEM education. What types of partnerships are expected between the collaborating universities? Would each university be expected to have their own research questions, or is it expected that the research questions would be the same for all collaborators? I ask because there are particular reasons and expertise of the different universities is strategic for our proposal. That's a great question. I would encourage you all to think about areas in which there is a common purpose and that you're developing a project in which, for example, you would want to look at variations in how your practices might play out at different institutions, whether of the same type or a different type. And that's the kind of, it may be helpful to talk about that in greater detail, but I would encourage you to position a collaborative project so that you could generate new knowledge and capitalize on the ways in which the distinct institutions would contribute to that. Having said that, there will be important perhaps variation in that, and you'll want to be able to capture that through your data gathering and analysis. Is it better for an administrator to write ICT proposals? Not necessarily. And there was a similar question of who can be a PI on ICT proposals. For PIs and co-PIs, like any of the projects, it's really important, regardless of your role, that you make clear in the proposal and in the bio sketches that you would submit, that you make clear the expertise on that project team, and that you have the expertise and capacity and time to carry out a project. So we're not looking for a certain employment line per se to be a PI or a co-PI. If you are engaged in work that's institutional in nature or crosses multiple institutions, letters of commitment can be incredibly helpful, and that's mentioned in the solicitation as well. So another question, is it possible to have a business partner for the ICT track or to create
sustainable impact?
Potentially so. I can imagine there's nothing that would
certainly preclude you from including
Thank you. I was looking for that word. Yeah, there's nothing that would preclude you from that. You'll just want to make sure that you've made clear the strengths of that business partner and how that's an asset to the project, to the reviewers. Another question, can a community be a community of discipline-based faculty across a broad number of institutions that are not linked by any professional organization, i.e. an informal community brought together by a common goal? Absolutely. If there's not the appropriate group in place, this ICT funding might be a really good opportunity for you to build out something like that. It will be important for you to articulate how that proposed work differs from prior efforts or other groups to make sure that that those strengths would be addressed directly. New question, can an ICT extend to non-STEM domain faculty and students in an effort to build a community culture across the campus? I think that it really depends on the nature of the work. As Ellen said earlier, it's certainly the case that the IUSE program supports undergraduate STEM education for students, whether they're majors or non-majors. I think we have had prior work, for example, thinking about science communication and partnerships with journalists or journalism faculty members. So there are examples in which we've funded that kind of work. It'll be important that it's situated for undergraduate STEM education. I think that we've made that clear. But those kinds of partnerships, if they lend strength to the project, are completely appropriate.
Yeah, and we've also had partnerships with business schools would be another example.
Good
There's
example.
been a lot of examples like that. We ready to move on?
Sure.
I think we can.
Okay. So we want to talk about some of the logistics. As you'll see, this slide shows you the types of proposals. There are multiple levels for the two tracks. So it's in engaged student learning. So just as a refresher, that's focused on increasing engagement and learning through new tools, resources, and models, or generating new knowledge about student learning. There are three levels that vary in the potential maximum budgets and durations. So level 1 is up to $300,000 and up to 3 years in duration. Level 2, $300,000 to $600,000, and again up to 3 years in duration. And level 3, $600,000 to $2 million with a maximum duration of 5 years. In the institutional and community transformation track, it's a little bit different. We have a new proposal type that I'm going to talk about in more depth in a moment, which is capacity building, where we're really focused on supporting institutions that have not been leads in prior institutional and community transformation or IUSE awards. And so that's really what capacity building awards are about.
For those that haven't had institutional community transformation awards.
Correct. We also have level 1, so similarly, a maximum potential budget of $300,000 and up to 3 years in duration. And level 2, which for single institutions, the maximum potential budget is $2 million, but for projects that are larger in scope with multiple institutions or from research centers, as you'll see in a moment, can have a maximum potential budget of $3 million and a duration of up to 5 years. There are a couple of different deadlines that you need to be mindful of. With level 1 and capacity building proposals, regardless of track on level 1, the deadlines are February 4th, 2020, and the first Tuesday in February thereafter. And then again, approximately 6 months later, August 4th of 2020, and the first Tuesday in August thereafter. With the larger level proposals, level 1 and level 2 or level 3, we have a deadline coming up December 4th in 2019 in a few weeks, and in years hence, it'll be the first Tuesday in December thereafter. So the capacity building proposals types, as Ellen alluded to, they may be submitted as individual or collaborative projects. The maximum award size is $150,000 for a single proposal from a single institution, or $300,000 for a multi-institutional proposal. And the maximum duration of both the single or multi-institutional proposals is 2 years. They are expected to enable institutions that have not served as the lead institution on a prior institutional and community transformation award to identify a project of interest. And in the service of this, in a 2-year duration, funding for these projects is intended to support efforts to assess institutional needs, formulate departmental and/or institutional commitments, develop necessary campus partnerships, audit prior institutional efforts, gather data, learn about relevant theories of change, identify relevant institutional practices and policies, and formulate plans for advancing institutional or community transformation. Proposals are encouraged to include a variety of participants, such as disciplinary or educational researchers, assessment and evaluation experts, and advisors and institutional leaders. Funds for capacity building proposals are intended to defray costs such as coordinating among project participants, sharing data, and attending relevant meetings, including the IUSE EHR PI meetings. The project timeframe, and this is important, is intended to allow institutions to host one or more working meetings at which stakeholders and potential research partners might ultimately develop an ICT Level 1 or Level 2 proposal. That was a lot of text. What we want to convey is that this is an opportunity for you to pull together a plan for your project, marshal expertise and the relevant stakeholders on your campus, but also think carefully about potential research partners that might enable you to think about theories of change or even further build out theories of change and generate new knowledge in that way. And that whole process is designed to prepare you to develop an ICT Level 1 or Level 2 proposal. A Level 1 description, this is coming directly out of the solicitation. They have a maximum award size, as I mentioned before, of $300,000 and a duration of 3 years. The awards at this level are intended for early stage or exploratory projects, or small to mid-scale projects that build on prior work. We've already talked about the deadlines associated with that. The Level 2 range, again, from $300,000 to $2 million if it's a single institution, or up to $3 million for collaborative projects from 2 or more institutions or from research centers studying phenomena of broad potential impact. So an example of that was the third research award example that I gave you that was about guided pathways. That's an example of a proposal coming from a research center. So Level 2 projects have a maximum duration of 5 years and are intended to support design and development work or impact research. The impact research reference is coming from a common guidelines of educational research, and you can find the reference to that in the IUSE solicitation. So projects at this scale and scope may be disciplinary, interdisciplinary, or multidisciplinary in nature and are intended to examine and/or incorporate broad communities of institutions, departments, or faculty. So you may want to talk to a program officer if you have questions about whether or not your program or your project idea have sufficient scale and scope to warrant support at the level 2 level. Prior work need not have been funded through the IUSE EHR program, but it should provide data and document expertise of the project team in support of the project objectives. That is to say, if you're focused on a level 2 project, make sure that you have the right pieces in place that signal that your project is appropriate for scaling up or for being just a large-scale project to begin with. So the work is expected to contain robust research plans, including either significant research questions or large-scale evaluation efforts, along with appropriate assessment efforts. So I encourage you again to contact NSF program officer prior to preparation of a submission for a full proposal to get a sense of whether or not the project that you have in mind is suitable to a level 2
And just to remind you, the contact information for all NSF program officers associated with this program is on the IUSE webpage, so you can find that at the NSF website, and it has email and phone number contact information for all program officers. So it might be advisable to think about preparing a one-page outline of your ideas, picking a program officer who has relevant expertise, possibly disciplinary or interdisciplinary expertise to match your project, and send them a query about the suitability of your project for this particular level.
Okay, we're going to pause here. We've just gone through a lot to field some questions. So I'm sure some questions have already come in, but feel free to add some additional questions. And since we've gone through so much material, we'll probably pause for these questions or field questions for a little bit longer maybe than last time. Okay, first question, can an ICT project that is focused largely on the meso level, e.g. resources, faculty development, network development, also include an implementation and evaluative component at the micro level, pedagogical strategy, student outcomes? That's a fabulous question. I encourage you to, for example, if it's appropriate, look at outcomes, student outcomes, or the faculty outcomes, to ensure that the changes that you're trying to enact have had the effects that you intend. That is a fabulous question, and it's a really important one, and I'd encourage you to pull data as you think appropriate at the micro level. Okay, next question. If you were suggesting a new theory of change, would it make sense to start with a capacity building project? That's a good question. I think of, and you should feel free to contact me directly, this is Andrea, if you want to follow up. I think of capacity building proposals as being for institutions that have not yet been on a lead for an ICT project to date. And that may be because you just haven't, it hasn't been the right time to engage in that kind of work, or that you're at an institution that doesn't have those hasn't had those pieces pulled together prior, and you may not already have expertise in theories of change. If you're developing a new theory of change, you may be working with people that are already expert in that literature. And if that is the case, then capacity building may not be an appropriate place for you to start. If by theory of change, you are thinking of the Connolly and Seymour slide and the article that we were referencing there, in which you're enumerating the implied elements of your project, then that's an example in which capacity building, that kind of activity, could be exactly the right thing for you to do. So I would be happy to talk to you in more detail about your specific project.
Okay, we have a question about eligibility and about who is actually eligible to apply for the capacity building track. The capacity building track is intended for institutions that have not had ICT track proposals before. So that is an institution. They may have had an IUSE award, they may have had an STEM or a NOISE award. None of those are disqualifying, but it would be disqualifying if your institution has been awarded an Institutional and Community Transformation Award. So that's the only disqualification. Anybody else is certainly eligible to apply in the capacity building track.
Okay. How is level 1 different than capacity building? Capacity building is really, we have a very specific kind of activity in mind, not the individual components, but when we, in the last year, prior to developing the current solicitation, when it was under design, we wanted to make sure that a broader range of institutions could avail themselves of institutional and community transformation awards. And so that is a very specific type of proposal that we called out to enable more institutions, or to be more explicit in signaling that we wanted an additional number of institutions to apply. The level 1 proposal could undertake any type of project within the budgetary and the time constraints that were identified. So level 1s are much more broad in scope and purpose.
Yeah, I mean, they're really projects that are sort of getting off the ground. They're not ones that are trying to figure out where they're going, essentially.
Okay, good. Another one. The examples cited explore research questions about institutional change, but do not specifically focus on specific areas of student growth and understanding of content or practices. Can the research questions embedded in an ICT proposal be focused on student development level? Yes, I think that would be incredibly helpful, because again, the point is not to make change, the point is to make effective change. And having specific measures of student outcomes or faculty outcomes as well that are moving your institutional goals forward are completely appropriate. So yes, it's appropriate and may add significant strength to your project if you're looking at the student outcomes. Another question, can you apply for level 2 funding if you have never had an IUSE award? Yes, you can. You need not go through the other levels, either capacity building or level 1, to get or to apply for an IUSE ICT level 2 award. Okay, new question. Similar to institutional change of an institution, does ICT apply to an organization's professional development of faculty from many institutions, which we propose will lead to community institutional change? Yes. So you could be working on faculty development amongst faculty members across institutions. The way that we define community has to do, and you can see this in the solicitation, it may be a physics community, it may be a biology community, or any other way of identifying NSF-supported field of economists. And they may run across institutional boundaries, and in fact, that may be a real strength of the proposal. And if you look at prior awards, that kind of activity, that kind of work has been funded earlier. New question, how best can an applicant demonstrate support from a provost or president? My understanding is that letters of support are not allowed. Okay, I love that question.
We get asked this one all the time.
It's a really important one, and the nomenclature that the NSF uses is a little confusing because they sound synonymous. Letters of support used to be allowed. Okay, so there's, some of you will know about the policies and procedures.
Yeah, Proposals and Awards, Policies and Procedures Guide, PAPG for short.
Thank you, Ellen. In which this is the kind of thing that's addressed there. A letter of support has the connotation of it's a statement of enthusiasm for a project. It is not a statement of commitment. Letters of commitment, on the other hand, are allowed. And there's some very specific language in the PAPPG and also in the IUSE solicitation that I would encourage you to look at. But in effect, what it does is it makes it so that a letter contains an affirmation that the activities that were described in your proposal, in your 15-page narrative, that if the person writing a letter of commitment is saying, I commit to carrying out the responsibilities or the activities or the duties that were implied in the narrative that you submitted. So that's a fabulous question about the difference between a letter of support and a letter of commitment. Okay. All right. New question. If the outcomes you are working to affect are in postgraduate employment for underserved populations, how can the lag time, 4 or 5 years, be accounted for within the time limit of an award? That's a fabulous question. And it may be the case that it's outside the scope of the time that you would have if you are looking at a specific intervention. Now, it may be the case that you want to construct a research project that is looking at interventions that were made in an earlier era, and so which, in that case, your research time frame may include students 5, 10 years after the initial intervention. So that might be a really interesting and innovative way to pose and frame research questions that apply to undergraduate STEM education.
Are you ready to move on?
Yes. Okay, those were fabulous questions.
Thank you
very much. Okay, we're going to talk about program expectations.
So the IUSE has a couple of expectations. There's sort of global expectations that we think might apply to all projects, although some projects may fit within, more within one of the 3 pillars, and that's fine. But these are the things that we're hoping for the program as a whole. We really want this program to build knowledge about STEM teaching and learning at the undergraduate level. And this can certainly be achieved through things like developing novel, creative, and transformative approaches to undergraduate STEM teaching and learning. We really like the phrases novel, creative, and transformative. That gets used at NSF a lot. So we really are looking for ideas that are interesting, creative, and hopefully can transform the student population that you're working with. Now, this can be students within your own classroom at a single institution or broad communities of students across an entire nation, spanning several disciplines. We hope to incorporate evidence-based STEM practices or evidence-based practices in STEM teaching and learning. So that's to build on knowledge that has already been gained in the field, some of which has been supported by NSF and some of which has been gathered through other mechanisms. We also hope within this particular pillar to be able to adapt, improve, replicate, and include these types of teaching practices in STEM teaching and learning. We also hope to build and understand systemic change in undergraduate STEM education, and the institutional and community transformation track speaks very specifically to this particular pillar. And within this track, we hope to lay the groundwork for sustained departmental, institutional, or community transformation and improvement. So gaining new knowledge. We expect that all proposals that are going to be awarded through the IUSE EHR mechanism to increase knowledge about effective STEM education. Now this knowledge can be actually gained in several different ways, one of which is to pose 1 or more research questions and hopefully answer them within the course of your project, or to provide an evaluation of project activities, impacts, or outcomes that will lead to generation of new knowledge. Successful proposals do a lot of different things, and so this is sort of a laundry list of things that we hope that successful proposals will do. We hope that they will build on what's known, so that includes usually doing a literature review or summarizing prior evidence in the field to help you define a starting point for the work that you're proposing to do. It's really hard to justify where you're going to be moving forward if you don't know where you've come from. We hope that in IUSE proposals, investigators will include a well-designed plan to gather data, and that the methods of analysis that will be used will be specified, that will be employed to answer the questions that are posed. We hope that IUSE proposals will include mechanisms to evaluate the success of the project. And this is both formative and summative evaluation. So we want the projects to sort of assess what's happening as the projects unfold, so any needed course corrections can be made before the project ends, and then also to summarize at the end what exactly has been learned and achieved through the efforts of the project. We hope that materials that are generated or information that is learned in IUSE proposals can be shared with the broader community. And this type of dissemination can actually take many, many different shapes. Published papers are certainly one accepted way, presentation at conferences, or things that are more creative, like we've seen proposals that will suggest sponsoring Reddit Ask Me Anything forums, which is a really interesting idea for disseminating new materials. We hope that projects will address their sustainability. We intend NSF awards to provide you with a way to start and hopefully learn something through your project, but we don't intend it as an ongoing mechanism to support a project over a long period of time. So plans for what would happen at the end of the project should actually be built into the proposal. And we hope that investigators will collaborate with others as needed to gather the necessary expertise to actually execute the project that they're intending to put together. So collaboration with other investigators, with other institutions, or with communities that are going to be helpful in achieving the goals of the project.
In terms of methods of analysis, it's important to align the research or evaluation methods with the questions that you've posed. Select appropriate methods to perform the study, which may be qualitative, quantitative, or a mixture of both. Sometimes people assume, wrongly, because we're at the National Science Foundation, that somehow there is an advantage to just quantitative data. We're really hoping that you will identify the appropriate kinds of data to address important evaluation or research questions that you've proposed. Again, we're looking at what works for whom and in what contexts. Okay, so we have another opportunity for questions here. We have about another 15 minutes left in our webinar, and so much of that, I suspect, will be focused on some of the questions. Do we have good ones that have come in? They've been fabulous so far. In a collaborative proposal, how do you differentiate between a statement of work and a letter of commitment? Do you recommend both? Usually in NSF speak, statement of work is a very specific phrase that's more about a contract.
And not about a grant.
Typically, what we see in proposals are work plans or research plans. And can we go back to that one?
Sorry.
Oh, that's right.
I already moved it.
That's right. I'm sorry, I missed
a statement of work and a letter of commitment. How do we differentiate between a statement of work and a letter of commitment?
Okay.
That was the remainder of that question.
All right, good. So a statement of work would be something altogether different. For a letter of commitment, that may apply to the plans that you have articulated in your proposal, whether your project plan or your research plan, and a letter of commitment would mean that the person who is identified who's signing that letter is committing to the activities that were enumerated in that particular plan. Okay, new question. Can one person submit to both engaged student learning and institutional and community transformation track with one idea? One more on student learning classroom intervention and one on building faculty capacity, fostering faculty learning communities on that instructional innovation. I think that's a great question. I would encourage you to pick one track or the other, and Ellen will tell me if she has a different read on it. But basically, as I mentioned before, those two tracks are the flip side of the same coin. And what you should do is to identify when you look at the project plan in its totality, where is the preponderance of work taking place? Would you characterize it more in terms of the engaged student learning and developing materials, or in terms of the institutional and community transformation?
And I think this is a place where a program officer can actually be really helpful. If you are not quite sure which of those two tracks is the one that's relevant, I really strongly urge you to contact a program officer, send them an outline of your ideas, and they can help you disentangle which of those tracks would be better suited to the work.
Okay, new question. Do all proposals need to involve more than one department or institution? No, they need not include more than one department or institution. If it is within a single department or institution, think about the scope and the level that you would be submitting your proposal to in the ICT program. Certainly for level 1, that might be entirely appropriate for a single department. Sometimes we see larger proposals from large institutions that might be suited to level 2. So as Ellen said earlier, it might be a really good idea for you to talk to a program officer with the IUSE program to get a sense of that. Okay, new question. Can you further
expiate?
Okay, can I describe in greater detail more on the mixed methods used in both qualitative and quantitative methods? Are there limitations to the methods of research and analysis as well as the evaluation to use? You know, so in the case of the third project that was looking at guided pathways, there the project had, and I'm just drawing from the abstract, they had data, student record data from multiple institutions across the 3 states that were identified. And they were engaged in quantitative analysis of those data. And then they wanted to unpack their findings to have, to be able to ask, in effect, why questions. And so they were following up on the quantitative analysis with individual interviews and focus groups. And so those are qualitative research methods or approaches that enable to ask different types of questions than are quantifiable with the institutional level data. You might reverse that process, I can imagine, in a project as well. That is to say that you see a phenomena and you want to engage in qualitative research to ask people what their experiences are, and then based on your qualitative findings, develop a survey to follow up on that, to be able to quantify it, to use institutional data, or in fact to help you hone in and select on an instrument or a scale that's already been developed and make sure that it's appropriately aligned with your particular project. So those are a couple of examples in which you might start with qualitative and move to quantitative, or the reverse, start with quantitative and move to qualitative in having a mixed method study. Some people will also collect data simultaneously, and that's another approach.
Okay, here's another question. We have multiple institutions who have expressed interest in partnering with us on our proposed ICT Level 2 project. Will NSF expect letters of collaboration from every partner? If we have some but not all, is that okay? I'm going to ask you to put yourself in the shoes of a reviewer looking at this particular proposal. Would it be acceptable to you to have indications from some of the partners, but not necessarily all of them, included in the proposal? If the level of commitment that's expected of these institutions is fairly high, I mean, my personal feeling is that a letter of commitment would show a strong sign of support for this particular proposal. And I think review panels would actually question if letters were not there for partners that had major roles in the project.
I think in the main, that's exactly right. The second example that we had of an award was from the Council of Undergraduate Research, and they very specifically articulated a competition process that they would put in place to engage in a national search for institutions to work with them. So that is an unusual case, it's kind of an edge case. So what Ellen said is true in the main, but there are some interesting exceptions to that you might want to consider as well.
Okay, another question. Does a PI have to have a PhD in a STEM field? Could a science librarian with a master's degree serve as a PI? Absolutely. We have no limitations on the qualifications of the principal investigator. And this in particular works for community college faculty, many of whom actually don't have PhDs. But we also have a number of community college faculty members who are very successful IUSE PIs and are running research projects that have been serving both their interests and the interests of the community as a whole.
And we have had relatively few proposals that are housed, that have been funded, and actually very few, in my experience, that have been proposed that involve libraries and librarianships in STEM education. And
I think it'd be really interesting.
Yeah. So what we really want is for you to be detailed and specific about why you and your project team have the expertise that you need to carry out the project and the work that's proposed. We're not looking for specific types of titles or positions. New question, can I hire an international consultant to help me on an NSF project?
It's kind of a mixed answer. The answer can be yes. Having an international consultant can be appropriate in some cases. but using that particular consultant would need to be strongly justified in the proposal. And the justification would have to include a rationale why it has to be this particular person as opposed to someone with similar expertise based at a U.S. institution.
Okay, new question. Could you further elaborate on what differentiates the knowledge generation and program evaluation piece in the proposal writing? And that's a fabulous question. Sometimes the same data can be used for both purposes. I think of particularly evaluation that's formative in nature will enable you to make decisions in an informed way as a project is unfolding within a 3 to 5 year time frame. And that kind of evaluation work can be incredibly important in that. The same data may enable you to contribute to the literature base or use other forms of dissemination in generating new knowledge. And those are both completely appropriate and actually very important.
Okay, another question. What level of evaluation is required? Is there any preference for an outside evaluator, or can the evaluation be more embedded within the project? Or does it really just depend on the particular project? Within the new solicitation, actually, at the very end of the solicitation, there are some ideas of things that should be included in proposals. And one of the questions listed in that list does address this very directly. We believe that there should be an evaluation component, but we're actually leaving it up to the PI team to establish exactly what that evaluation component can look like. It can be a member of the project team, it can be an external evaluator, or evaluation efforts might be provided by an advisory board. So I think in putting together the project, you really want to think what is the best evaluation that's going to be suited for your particular project and proceed accordingly.
And you'll just want to make sure that you help the reviewers have a sense of confidence that you will be getting the appropriate type of feedback that you need to inform the decisions that you need to make as the project unfolds. Again, regardless of the mechanism in the position of your evaluator or advisory board.
Another question. Is it recommended that a level 1 grant include an intervention, or can we focus on descriptive analysis of the current state of professional development and its link to student understanding at multiple institutions in a level 1 grant currently, and then hope to learn from this to submit a level 2 in a few years? One of the possible examples that we provided, certainly in talking about the engaged student learning track, was the idea of doing synthesis or meta-analysis. And so I think this type of approach would certainly fit in that, where one is pulling together information that may already exist in a community or through a body of literature to understand what the best practices are. And then, yes, using that as a stepping stone to develop what might develop into a level 2 or a level 3 type of proposal, depending on which of the tracks you're in.
In keeping with that, meta-analysis and meta-synthesis are both very specific methodologies that enable you to compare prior fundings. The meta-analysis is looking, in effect, at effect sizes that have been calculated across other studies, and you're looking across studies to see the impact of a particular intervention. And meta-synthesis is enabling you to compare qualitative data, in effect. So if you have interest in that, please contact me, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about that kind of a proposal.
Another question. Can someone who already has an existing IUSE project apply for another IUSE project? Absolutely. We have no restriction on the number of IUSE projects that a single investigator can hold. Just be advised that when review panels look at projects that have investigators who are contributing to multiple projects, they will actually consider the amount of effort that an investigator will be able to dedicate to each of the separate projects. And so it can become sort of a limiting factor if an investigator is involved in too many projects. Review panels often find that they don't think that that investigator will have the appropriate time to dedicate to the new project.
Is there a suggestion for the number of students that are involved in an ICT project? A sense of how many students make a powerful study? If I understand the question correctly, and please follow up with me if I'm not, it is important to get a sense of, if you're doing an analysis, for example, that involves examining quantitative data, looking at the kind of sample size that you would need. And so there are things called power calculations that are important to do. And in fact, what that means is that in the measurements that you're taking, that if your confidence interval is not so large that you're not able to differentiate between whether treatment, if you will, is effective in one group or not in another, that you don't have sufficient data to be able to differentiate between the two. And that's where that kind of calculation in which you would have an appropriate sample size. There's also sampling that's really important in terms of qualitative research in getting a sense of if you have enough participants in a study. So I would encourage you to make sure that you have an individual on your project team or on your advisory board that can help you determine the appropriate number of participants in a study to ensure that you will be able to, with authority, answer the questions that you have posed with the data that you're gathering and the modes of analysis or methods of analysis that you're proposing.
Okay, another question. You mentioned faculty professional development under the Engaged Student Learning track. What about teaching professional development for graduate students? I certainly think that would be an appropriate avenue for study, but the end result and the desired outcome should actually be the effect on the undergraduate students. Certainly this would be considered what I think of as an indirect effect on the undergraduates, but it could certainly be appropriate since graduate students often perform the bulk of teaching at large research universities in things like mathematics curricula and things to that effect.
And we also funded projects that involve multi-generational development teams, course development teams that incorporate undergraduates, graduate students, and faculty members at different kinds of appointments. So there are multiple ways in which you might incorporate that, those kind of individuals in those roles and their professional development. We have about 3 minutes left, and so we want to make sure that we're able to go through the last few slides that point out some resources that might be helpful to you. Of course, our colleagues at AAAS have set things up so that you have resources that I mentioned earlier that are pointing to the IUSE EHR program webpage in our solicitation. That you're enabled to conduct searches from links there, but you can also go to nsf.gov and do an award search. And this slide deck, which you'll have access to, includes some suggestions on how to do that through screen snapshots. I encourage you to contact a program officer, and the names and contact information are on the program webpage. There are also, if you print out the solicitation, the PDF version, they're on page 13. There are additional helpful resources.
We've already mentioned the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide. This is really your Bible for everything related to proposal preparation. It has information on budgets. It has information on all of the different components of the proposal itself. It has some formatting information. It has questions on specialized mechanisms that sometimes proposals come in through. But it's really the first stop for when you're looking for information about how to put a proposal together. The common guidelines for education, research, and development we've mentioned several times throughout this webinar. It's actually a document prepared in collaboration with the National Science Foundation to help define exactly what educational research looks like. And so you may be able to find some helpful examples to guide you as you formulate your research plans if you go through that document. We have an overview of the merit review process that's posted to our National Science Foundation website, and this can be a very useful resource when helping to understand what panelists are instructed to look for in particular proposals. As you may know, once your proposal is submitted to the National Science Foundation, it will undergo a panel review. So we send it out to a set of reviewers. We have them provide their opinions, their expert opinions, on the proposal, on its structure, on what it's proposing to do, and all of this different information. And so we instruct those reviewers in things that they should be looking for within the proposal. And so some of the instructions that we provide for these reviewers is reviewed in this merit review overview that's available on the website. There is also a video that we show to all prospective reviewers called The Art and Science of Reviewing Proposals. And so it includes some very helpful information that reviewers also use in assessing proposals. So that can sort of help you look at your own proposal through the eyes of a reviewer.
The BICSR program is something through the EHR Core Research program, but it's an opportunity for you to put in a proposal if you would like to retool in terms of the research methodologies that you feel well versed in. So there are both individual awards, but we're also funding full institutes that are intended to help people retool, for example, in things like quasi-experimental design.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end of our major set of slides here. I would like to point out in the deck that you will be accessing, if you look at this particular deck on the website, there's some additional slides that relate to preparing proposals. We haven't had time to go through those slides today, but if you look at the slide deck from November 5th, we did actually cover those slides in that webinar. So if you use that deck and listen to the recording of that particular webinar, you'll hear the audio comments that we made on those slides. And so that may be helpful for those of you, particularly those of you who are new to NSF and new to preparing proposals using the NSF format. We thank you for your participation today. There are a lot of you signed up for this, and we got a number of great questions provided through the question box. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to answer everything that came up, but you do always have the option to contact a program officer and to see if you have specific questions that they might be able to answer. I would like to remind you, if you're contacting them with regard to projects that you're thinking about, it's really helpful to have a 1- to 2-page outline of your project that you will attach to an email that you will send to the program officer. That allows them to have an understanding of your project before they schedule a conversation with you or before you engage in an email exchange to help refine and define the parameters of your particular project.
So thanks for your time today, and thank you for your interest in the IUSE program.